So there is a German word which is called Kummerspeck, and its literal translation is grief bacon. And what it means, it's the excess weight that someone puts on due to emotional overeating. And like many foreign words, there isn't really one English word that can adequately translate what it means. And there's a Hebrew word that's really important to the Old Testament and in the story of Ruth, and that word is hesed. And like Kummerspeck, it can't be easily translated with one English word. Hesed can mean goodness, kindness, faithfulness, and love. A decent translation of the word would be loyal love. Hesed is how the Old Testament describes God's love for us. And while the word is also used for human relationships, over 2/3 of its use is describing God's hesed to humans. Hesed is more an intent, an action, than a feeling, and it speaks of God's covenantal love for us, those of us who call him Lord. So Ruth comes directly after the book of Judges. And if you remember Judges, so coming after the abysmal and sordid events that we hear in Judges, it provides an almost fairy tale-like description of life in ancient Israel. Provided, of course, that those fairy tales are a Grimm Brothers fairy tale, where there is death and darkness before you get to the happy ending. So I'll read from the NIV. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, his husband died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other named Ruth. After they'd lived there for about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died. And Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So that's how the book opens. So we're not going to have time to go through the whole book line by line, which is why it's good to have the video. Kind of gave us the story of Ruth. But there is a lot to unpack in that very short opening. So because of a famine, a man leaves Bethlehem, which somewhat ironically means house of bread, and travels with his wife and sons to Moab, a traditional enemy of Israel, and all the men die. However, not before the 2 sons have married local girls, Orpah and, of course, Ruth. So there's some interesting stuff going on here. The name Elimelech means God is king, which fits nicely with the last lines of the book of Judges, which we talked about comes just before Ruth. And that line is Judges 21:25. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. Naomi means beautiful or pleasant. However, the boys' names are quite ominous. Whether they're actual names or more like nicknames, they actually end up meaning sickness and death. So there's potentially some foreshadowing going on here with those names. So a man whose name means God is king abandons the promised land because there's a famine which may have been a judgment from God. So instead of turning to God, he takes his wife and family to a foreign land with, of course, a foreign and quite nasty God. So there is an argument that the deaths of the men and the family are a result of Elimelech's lack of faith in God, the king. And of course, the death of the menfolk leave Naomi and her daughters-in-law in a very precarious position. However, In the story we hear that God has come to the aid of his people by providing food for them. So the women prepared to go to Bethlehem, and they set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. So God's provision of food for his people is only one of two incidents in the entire story where we hear of the direct intervention of God. God is in a sense silent but not absent in this story. Because as we will see, human agency or action is an important part of the Book of Ruth. And at some point on this journey, Naomi tells her daughters-in-law to turn back. Naomi, as a widow, with no sons, faces an uncertain future in Judah. And so it seems that as an act of kindness, she tries to send Ruth and Orpah back to their families. Naomi says this in verse 8. Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, hesed, as you have shown kindness, again hesed, to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband. But Orpah and Ruth, who clearly hold great affection for Naomi, say they'll both return with her to her people. So Naomi tells them again to return home. And it's clear that the restrictions of a patriarchal society are foremost in Naomi's mind. Or should I say the oppression of a patriarchal society. Right, sisters? It's clear Naomi believes that the best chance of these women is to try and find new husbands in their homeland, condemning herself to return to Bethlehem on her own. So Orpah does what is logical and reasonable. She kisses her mother-in-law goodbye. And the story makes no judgment on Orpah for returning home. It is actually the sensible thing to do. It's Ruth that makes the astonishing decision by staying with Naomi. And the story tells us that Ruth clings to Naomi. This expression conveys deep loyalty and affection. It implies even membership of one group to join another. The same expression is used in Genesis 2:24, where it says, "That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife," or clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. So Ruth also makes her extraordinary declaration of loyalty and love. Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. So Ruth's adventure in God starts as an act of hesed, an act of loyal love to Naomi. There's no voice from the sky, no burning bush or messenger angels for Ruth. As an act of hesed, of loving loyalty, she commits herself to Naomi and God and heads into the unknown. Because by swearing her commitment in the name of Israel's God, she is acknowledging him as her God. It would be nice to see this as a full-on conversion experience, but it's really more like a transfer of membership from Moab to Israel. And while someone leaving their homeland behind to start a new life may sound a bit like Abraham, Abraham was told by God to leave and promised a blessing. All Ruth has is her pledge to Naomi. And so they arrive in Bethlehem, which causes a bit of a stir, with the women explaining, "Can this be Naomi?" And this is where Naomi says, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter." I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. This is accurate in one sense, but also a bit rude in another, seeing she actually came home with a very loyal daughter-in-law. But we shouldn't be too harsh. She is a product of the times. And this brings us to the end of the first chapter, which closes by telling us the barley harvest was beginning. In the next chapter, we find out there was a man called Boaz, a man of standing and a relative of Naomi's husband. And when Ruth offers to go out and glean at harvest, as we saw, to pick up the grain that's been missed or left behind, she ends up doing so in a field belonging to Boaz. The right for the poor to glean in the fields at harvest times was enshrined in the law. And this is part of the hesed of the story. In a time where people were doing what were described as doing what they saw as fit, what we see in Ruth is people acting in covenantal love and loyalty towards each other. Now, the fact that Ruth ended up in a field belonging to Boaz is described in the story as a coincidence. Something that happened by chance. And Boaz arrives on the scene and greets the harvesters with, "The Lord be with you." And he sees Ruth and asks after her. And he's told that she is the Moabite who came from Moab with Naomi. Now, this is a title that Ruth will have throughout the story. Despite her 10-year marriage to a man from Judah and acknowledgement of God, she is always a Moabite. It's a bit like moving from the city to the country, or to Canterbury to Auckland. You're always a bit of an outsider. But the good thing about this is that it shows the inclusive and expansive nature of God's plan for humanity. Even before Jesus comes with his message of salvation for all, people from outside God's chosen people are being brought in. And in the case of Ruth, not only does she become a part of God's chosen people, she also becomes a part of Jesus' lineage. So Boaz speaks to Ruth and tells her to stick to his fields, and he will protect her and provide water for her. This naturally asks Ruth to ask, why have I found such favour in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner? So Boaz tells her that he has heard all about what she has done for Naomi. So he commends her for her hesed, her loving loyalty and commitment. And in turn, he treats her in the same way. He instructs his men to gather in a manner that allows her to collect quite a bit and feeds her at mealtime. Now, it's clear that Boaz is a decent bloke, a man of faith, as his greeting to the harvesters showed. And it's his faith that directs his actions, not an angel, not a prophet, anything like that. But it's clear that God is moving through all the events in Ruth, and is working through the everyday, ordinary acts of hesed, of the loyalty, love, and kindness that comes through in Ruth. So Ruth goes home with a full belly and some extra food for Naomi, and an ephah of barley, which is apparently a decent amount. And Naomi notices that Ruth has been looked after and asks where she was gleaning, and discovers to her delight there was Boaz who had looked after Ruth. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness, his hesed, to the living and to the dead." She added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." The language is ambiguous in Naomi's statement as to who he is that has shown his kindness to the living and the dead. However, in a sense that fits the story, because God and Boaz have both shown hesed, God through Boaz and Boaz through his actions, which demonstrate his faith in God. Ruth also tells Naomi that Boaz has told her to stay with his workers until the harvest is finished, which it seems is a safety issue as much as one of provision. So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. The seemingly innocuous finish to chapter 2 reveals something important. Ruth is still living with Naomi. If a reader had any hopes that all the attention Boaz has lavished on Ruth will become something more, at this stage, their hopes are dashed. Clearly, Ruth and Boaz never had the DTR that defined the relationship. So Naomi starts to scheme, although the Bible puts it in nicer terms. My daughter, I must find a home for you where you'll be well provided for. Now Boaz, with whose woman you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he'll be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you were there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. I mean, that's quite schemy, yeah. And a little bit sketchy.
Yeah.
Also, Naomi isn't acting on any direct instructions from God. She is, from her perspective at least, taking matters into her own hands. However, Ruth complies, puts on a nice frock, it's a Britney Spears midnight fantasy, and sneaks down into where Boaz is sleeping and uncovers his feet and lies down. Now, there is a suggestion that there is some euphemistic language being used here, that uncovering his feet means something else. And of course, to lay with someone can suggest sexual activity. However, in my study of this passage, I've come to the conclusion that while there are some unavoidable sexual overtones in Ruth's actions, it doesn't mean that this was a sexual encounter. And if it was, it kind of runs against the image we've seen of Ruth and Boaz so far as noble people with good character. So regardless of whatever exactly happened, it had the desired effect. And Boaz wakes up to find a woman lying at his feet. So naturally, he asks her who she is, which seems the only polite thing to do in the circumstances. She tells him this. I am your servant Ruth, she said. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are my guardian redeemer of our family. This is a request loaded with symbolism and meaning. It is a request for protection and provision. And it's also understood by Boaz as a proposal of marriage. The word is never used, but Ruth's intention is clear. Remember, she is there because Naomi wanted her to have a home, which meant for her to find a husband. Boaz responds positively with a blessing. The Lord bless you, my daughter. Excuse me. The Lord bless you, my daughter, he replied. This kindness, this hesed, is greater than which you have showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do all you ask. But of course, like any great story, there is a complication to be resolved before we can have our happy ending. Boaz continues. Although that is true, I am your guardian redeemer of our family, there is another more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good, let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning. So Ruth stays until morning and then sneaks home so she isn't recognised. Because Naomi's plan, while thus far at least effective, still a bit sketchy. And at the end of chapter 3, Ruth and Naomi can do nothing but wait. However, Boaz is good as his word. And when the kinsman with the prior claim refuses to act because he doesn't want to endanger his own estate, Boaz steps in. He buys the previously unmentioned property of Elimelech from Naomi and also announces that he has acquired Ruth as his wife. And then as the story comes to a close, we hear of the only other direct intervention of God when he enables Ruth to conceive, giving birth to a son, who they call Obed, who was the father of Jesse, the father of King David. And so all's well that ends well, and we have our fairy tale ending. So what's the message today for us? I think it's this. God is at work in our everyday, ordinary lives. The start of Ruth's adventure was an act of hesed. The story of Ruth is propelled by people's acts of hesed, acts of loyal love, by people living up to their covenantal obligations to each other. We don't need an angel or a burning bush or a prophet to tell us what we should do. We should know what to do. The Bible tells us what we should do. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. James 1:27 says this. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. God is at work in the world all around us all the time. And all we need to do to be right with God is to do what we already know is right. As Christians, we should be actively concerned about the racial, social, and economic equality in New Zealand. We should be concerned about the price of housing, about the environment, and child poverty. And the list goes on. And we should be finding ways to help, however small they may feel. Because in every act of kindness, mercy and love, every act of hesed in the name of God, there is some of His light shining through a world that desperately needs it. Amen.